Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this first Nordic breakout session here at ECEC. I hope that you have enjoyed the event so far. And first of all, I would like to provide you with a short overview of the EQS Group, which is the organizer of this group, of this event, sorry. EQS Group was founded in 2000 in Munich and have in the recent years grown into a leading international provider in the fields of investor relation, corporate compliance, and sustainability reporting. EQS employs about 600 professionals across offices in the world's key financial market, where I, Ulrik, am leading the Nordic office from Copenhagen. So now on the ECEC, which has become a reoccurring event on the European compliance and ethic calendar, this year's theme is centered around whether we are living in a world forced to be good. The focus is on compliance and ethic and how the implementation of a corporate culture, which is built on transparency and integrity, creates the most important corporate capital, trust. However, an increasingly complex regulatory landscape demands more in-depth discussion about new laws as well as increased demand to reporting standard. So some word about the Nordics. The European rollout of the EU Whistleblowing Directive has been far slower than expected, and the bulk of member states missed the transposition deadline, which were ultimo 2021. Denmark was actually the first country in the EU to implement the directive with this new law on beskyttelse af whistleblower. Sweden had then followed with the gennemførende af Whistleblowing Directive, sorry for the accent, which had its deadline roughly 3 months ago. The process has not moved as quickly in Finland, but progress have indeed been made in recent weeks, and a draft law has now been issued that is broader in the scope than the minimum requirement of the directive. So the transposition is one step closer. While not being an EU member, Norway has a strong whistleblowing protection through the Norwegian Working Environment Act of 2007, which was last updated January 2020. It is different from the EU Whistleblowing Directive in the way that extended company stakeholders are not afforded protection, such as former employees, family members, job seekers, etc. The EU directive may eventually be transposed in Norway if the EEA EFTA states classified as EEA relevant. It is now essential for compliance officers and company heads in the Nordics, as well in Europe, to be aware of the legal requirement of the EU Whistleblowing Directive in order to avoid any possible sanction for their organization. So a few key points to consider are that all organizations with 50 or more employees are affected. Functioning whistleblowing channels must be created. Retaliation is prohibited. Cases must be handled impartially. Whistleblowers must be protected, and feedback has to be provided at set intervals. ESG has been mentioned quite a lot on the ECEC already, and embracing the G for governance is going to be crucial in satisfying the new regulatory requirements. Most companies are already familiar with governance, and that is actually a major benefit when it comes to rolling out an effective compliance framework. While the enacted legislation in Denmark and Sweden, along with the forthcoming transposition in Finland, represent a huge leap for the whistleblower's right, the law nevertheless still present a major challenge for compliance officers across the region. And that is what we are here today to discuss. I am delighted to hand over the floor to Antti Aalto from KPMG in Finland, who is the head of legal compliance, who will get our first session started on the EU Whistleblowing Directive transposition, learnings from Denmark and Sweden, and the upcoming whistleblower protection law in Finland. So, Antti, please.
Thank you, Ulrik. Pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to report that also in Helsinki we have sunshine to celebrate the occasion instead of the steady rain that we've been having during the past 24 hours. So welcome indeed. Um, can we have the slideshow on? Thank you, and move on to the next slide, please, if you can. Or is that in my command? Well, basically, what I seek to do is to bring you up to speed as regards the directive interpretation and the national transposition in Finland of the law. So we have a draft law in place at the parliament since 2 weeks, basically. And what we see there is that the Finnish interpretation is pretty closely following those interpretations and evidence from the directive itself. But we do have our peculiarities as regards to the transposition. Just to put you on the sort of scale of things, the Finnish government proposition for whistleblower protection law contains 300 pages. In comparison, the German proposition contains 120 pages. So the Finnish proposition is rather detailed. And what we'll do during the presentation is try to make a connection with the what is the whistleblower regime actually trying to establish, and that is to tie it to the governance requirements of organizations. And moving on, please. What I'd like to bring to your attention or into your consideration is the question of how to interpret the national legislations. We have rather different interpretations in Denmark and in Sweden already. Another sort of line of interpreting what are the minimum requirements of the directive that needs to be implemented nationally. The Germany is a good example on that. Germany actually calls in as reportable items any transgression against German national law or regulation as compared to the directive. And what I want to point out at this stage is that in international comparison, the European Union whistleblower protection regime is only the second in the world that is considered to be protective towards the whistleblower. And the first one, of course, is that of the United States of America. So what we have from European and especially from Nordic point of view is quite a quantum leap in requirements attached to the process of whistleblowing and whistleblower protection and the management of whistleblowers within any given organization. And moving on. What we have in the general regime of whistleblower European Union directive is the idea that basically the employer units or companies are incentivized to provide a credible and effective procedure to sound concerns from a protected position. And that's probably due to a study that was commissioned by the European Commission in 2017, which concluded that 3 out of 4 Europeans that had observed wrongdoings in their workplace dare not report the wrongdoings due to fear of retaliation. 3 out of before did not report out of fear of retaliation. And what that means is basically the management of the company or the employer organization is deprived of information which they basically need in order to discharge their duties as the directors. So here, in my opinion, is the most compelling reason to have a proper functioning protecting whistleblower regime in your company. Your management's ability to discharge their duties depends on the credibility and functioning of the whistleblower system and process. And there are many details in this, and I will jump through this, just touching on the directive and the Finnish proposed law. And the directive and the Finnish regimes are similar in the sense that there's a 3-month period of precedence or even privilege for the company to have the suspicion, i.e. the whistleblower information, and to address that if the company-owned whistleblowing system and process is up to par with the directive requirements. And that's a big advantage as compared to not having such a proper system and organization, as if you don't have that, you lose the privilege to that information. And the informant can go to the public channels at the company's protection to blow the whistle. Hence, the company needs to still protect the whistleblower, even though the management does not have the information and hence cannot act on that information. So a very strong incentive to actually have a proper system and organization in place and to document it as required in directive and in national transpositions of it. The employer's obligations, the Finnish law is rather detailed in that sense, and I shall not bother you with too much detail, but these detailed actions that you can read are actually quite illustrative of what is actually stated not so clearly, I admit, in the directive. The directive itself has been sort of blamed of being very difficult to interpret, and I'm unable to disagree with that blemish. But we've been doing this for about 3 years now, 4 years almost, and I think we've got a reasonably clear picture of what are the requirements of the directive, and hence what should the national legislation also contain. An interesting point in the sense of why the European Union directive is considered to be protective towards the whistleblower and hence generative of information is the extent of protection it offers to the whistleblower. And I'd like to say that the protection almost reaches but never touches the United States law principle of punitive damages, i.e. paying extra, not only the damages, but a compensation for the person being mistreated in one way or the other. But in this point, it is quite, in my opinion, important to notice that it does not pay punitive damages. So it's not a get-rich scheme. Another thing is, which I think most of you are familiar, is the reverse burden of proof. So if something bad happens to a whistleblower, the company is liable to prove that it was not a revenge for the whistleblower. And if that cannot be done, the company is liable just as well as if the whistleblower goes to public channel. We have broken the requirements into 6 sort of thoughts or themes, and we probably just jump on the sort of headline level. And first and most difficult of the requirements is to create a technically administratively credible internal reporting channel. the difficulty does not arise only from the fact that the requirements of the directive are not crystal clear, to put it mildly, but require a fair bit of interpretation. But after that, you need to be in a position to clearly communicate the idea that your system is credible to your employees and other entitled constituencies, such as trainees and job applicants and hired hands even. The technical issues are rather difficult, and I think we have our host has showed some progress in that sense, that the EQS systems are quite satisfactory in the sense with regard to the directive requirements. Last summer, we had a bit of a discussion with reference to the Danish implementation and the Swedish implementation also, as European Commission stated that the channels should be arranged on a national or even employee level as organizations, and not only channels of a corporation. And my understanding that Commission probably has a different set of directive or different wording of directive than I have, because I haven't read from the directive anything to the effect of a requirement of having a separate channel for each company or separate channel in each sovereign state within the European Union. So it is very good of Commission to communicate an idea like this. However, we probably need to put a bit of salt on top of that opinion, or whether or not it is indeed based on directive or not. Now, the Finnish national interpretation or transposition does allow for a centralized system and centralized process. However, we need to address several other issues that arise with that choice. As to what should be allowed, directive is quite clear, even though it is difficult to read, and even the Finnish national law proposal is quite clear and still contains a bit of a misspelling error in the text. Written announcement on technical platform is the way to go. One of the most curious, in my opinion, Finnish national requirements is that the employer, so the party who is liable to arrange for the channel, is liable for the technical progress of the channel and the organizational progress of the channel of the organization. The latter is not quite surprising, but the actual due diligence that employer needs to put to work prior to acquiring a SaaS system for the whistleblowing is not exactly cheap or easy. So there probably attention to the self-clearances of the various SaaS providers. The resolution body comes from the directive, and this also varies from country to country whether or not you have two-layered system and process or one-layer system and process. The directive itself says it's two-layered. So there's a decisional level and there's an operational level. And that's quite understandable given the actual meaning of the system. The very basic ideas of the directive, then the whistleblower should be answered to in 7 days, nothing new there, and the feedback should be sent within 3 months of the report being received. And the only thing about the report is what can you disclose in the report for it to be sufficient. That's a topic of a separate lesson, so we'll get there some other day. One of the sort of, as I hinted in the just a couple of minutes ago, the difficult thing is how to create the credibility and trustworthiness of the system and process amongst your employees. This basically builds on two blocks. First, you have to have the administrational and technical prowess, and you have to have the ability to communicate it. And regardless of the system, not all systems are easily communicatable as trustworthy and reliable. On labor legislation requirements, I think that the Finnish approach, being very precise, is an easy one in the sense that it sets out the process pretty well, as compared to what was contained in the directive. So in that sense, I think the Finnish legislation is probably even useful in practical terms. And the GDPR issues, don't get me started on those. I think we are going to skip this, as the GDPR is a bit of a hot topic. I think it's sufficient to say that by Finnish standards and by European Union standards, usually the data privacy impact assessment is the rigor prior to implementation or major change of whistleblower system, as is the policy on how you deal with the sensitive or especially sensitive information that is likely to be found in the whistleblower system. And this is a big deviation from the data that you usually come by and process. The data that is processed in the whistleblower system is likely to contain suspicion of wrongdoing, even crime. It is likely to be connected with an identifiable person. Hence, it is especially sensitive personal information, and it needs to be protected with special care. One thing that the lawyers usually come up with is, okay, what do we want to as pieces of information into the channel? And these are the colorful balls. And I couldn't care less, because what's on the right bottom corner in my screen is the reason why the board of directors of each European company should probably call to the reliable and trustworthy whistleblower channel all discretions and misdemeanors that happen in the context of work life. That is because it's their duty and their way of actually discharging their liability as directors. They need to get access to that information, and hence they need to ask for it. And if they don't, someone will ask them, why exactly did you not want information on other items that the European Union directive enumerated breaches in your channel? And that is very, very difficult thing to explain, I guess. Now, to the governance issues, I will just briefly touch on this. This is the Finnish Companies Act, basically explained in 5 bullets. And basically, what it states is that, okay, you need to find out. If you didn't find out but tried, you are okay. But if you didn't try to find out through having an appropriate whistleblower system, you have a lot of explaining to do. Finally, a brief glimpse into Finnish versus US system and the European Union whistleblower system. What we have here is the hallmarks of appropriate compliance management of United States Ministry of Justice. From this is that in principle and in practice on many levels, requirements are the same. However, the US process and system is very different. Topic for quite a while now is the ISO 37301 standard. So the management or governance standard is the new one from last year. And again, we take a look at the requirements of appropriate governance and management, and the same topics and same doings pop up. So I conclude by stating that, okay, now we are pretty much aligned as regards global and local requirements. And I would like to hand over to my dear colleague, Erik Lagerlöf. He's not only a KPMG colleague, but a fellow at Cambridge and adjunct professor in Stockholm School of Economics. So whatever thoughts you may have had before and didn't dare to ask. After Erik, I think it's your moment. So, can we have Erik on the stage, please?
Hello. Hi. I hope that everybody can hear me, and I will see if I can get up my slides up. There we are. Hold on. There. I hope you can now all see this. I am watching my slides, and I hope that you can also see the slides. What I thought I might do is to put whistleblowing into context, and particularly in an ESG context. And I realize that we're on short on time, so I will run through this rather briefly. The agenda I had prepared was first to just merely flash out ESG obligations that you all now have to consider. Some of them are in force, some of them are expected to enter into force rather shortly, and some of them are still being considered within the EU institutions. I will then move on just briefly to the whistleblower legislation. That is something I will touch on only very briefly, given Antti's brilliant presentation before me. And then just briefly put whistleblowing into an ESG context, and also perhaps suggest a few steps that you may want to consider in your organization. Now, you are well aware of the extensive ESG requirements that now exist and that are waiting to enter into force. I have no intention at all to go through all these instruments, but this is just to give you an idea by way of showing a picture of the different instruments available. Some of them, as I said, are in force now. For example, the notorious taxonomy regulation. Some of them are expected to enter into force, and some of them are still being discussed. And of course, one very controversial instrument that we're waiting for is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that we'll hear about later. That will, in my view at least, enforce rather extensive obligations that, at least in a Swedish perspective, is quite unheard of. On the new whistleblowing rules, I could only say this about the Swedish legislation. It actually did enter into force on the 17th of December of last year, as it should, but it didn't start to apply before mid-July of this year. It is much broader in scope than the directive. The directive obviously focuses on breaches of EU rules, whereas the Swedish legislation also focuses on national law, provided they occur in a work-related context. I think what I would like to emphasize is the discrepancy that may exist between the directive and the Swedish national legislation. Having gone through the Swedish legislation, I think there are a few issues with that, and it is not entirely, in my view, it has not entirely implemented the directive correctly. And my advice would certainly be that you very carefully read through the obligations of the directive and compare those with the Swedish national legislation. There are a few provisions that to me seem contrary to the directive. And what happens then, well, as Antti mentioned, I believe, is that, of course, the directive takes precedence, given the primacy of EU law over national law. So I think that is an important point to remember going forward, that you cannot only consider the national legislation, you will also have to look at the directive in parallel. And some of the key obligations, I will not go through that, but just to mention that there are sanctions available in the Swedish national legislation if you would not implement the directive correctly, or sorry, if you would breach some of the obligations that are now available both in national legislation and in the directive. And in particular, you may have to pay rather heavy damages. Putting whistleblowing in an ESG context, again, only very briefly, I think you all realize that there are extensive ESG requirements to consider. But I think the whistleblowing legislation must be considered as a tool for you regarding the implementation of these tough new ESG requirements. I think whistleblowers must be considered as the first line of defense against wrongdoing. It is there for you to, if you handle it correctly, the whistleblower will assist you in preventing and indeed correcting an irregularity before it escalates, before it becomes more of a problem than it actually already is. So dealt with correctly, I think the whistleblower and the whistleblowing legislation is there to assist you when you implement the tough new ESG requirements. And it's meant to build a culture where complaints and misconduct are managed in a secure and confidential manner. I think that is the appropriate way to look at the new legislation, rather than as some rather difficult new tool that you must all now have to consider. But it's there, or if used or handled properly, it is there to assist you in your organization. Just a few steps to consider. Well, obviously, I think you would have to comply with the regulations, but there's one point in particular that I would like to stress, is that given that the directive provides minimum standards, meaning that member states are able to go further, which indeed has happened in Sweden, you will all have to, if you have operations ongoing in different EU member states, it's not sufficient to only consider one member state and the legislation that is enforced there, or indeed only the directive. You will still have to look at all the different member states that you have operations in order to understand the obligations of each and every member state. You should also, or you may want to consider whistleblowing training, in particular to middle management, who are normally the first line of recipients for these sort of complaints. You may want to also consider certain internal reporting campaigns. You may also want to conduct risk assessments, reviews of your ESG policies in light of whistleblowing obligations, and see if they are aligned and if they function well together. That was what I've done now is just whip through the available ESG requirements, and to put that into context with the new whistleblowing requirements in the Whistleblowing Directive, but also in Swedish and also in other member state national legislations, to provide context, perhaps, I understand only very briefly, but provide a context in which the new whistleblowing tool is meant to operate. So I think I'm well aware of the time. I think I will stop there and hand over to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik, and Antti as well for the insightful perspective, but also for adding the ESG perspective to this. For our next session, we will slightly change topic and instead dig into sustainability. And for this subject, we are so lucky to have with us Kristiina, Kouros, Doctor of Laws, KPMG Nordics, who, among other things, have worked for many years with human rights. Kristiina will focus on what it is that companies should prepare for the coming corporate sustainability due diligence directive. So, Kristiina, please.
Thank you, Ulrik, and thank you for Antti and Erik for the excellent presentations on the whistleblowing. So, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, as Erik already mentioned, is not a finished product in Norway yet. It is in making, and I'm trying to see, I cannot move my slides at the moment, so let's I continue speaking while we'll figure this out. So, or maybe my apologies. Here we go. It was my mistake, as usually with technology. In very short words, CSR DDD CSDDD or CS3D, however you like to abbreviate the name, proposes mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. Human rights due diligence is in a way a new concept. It's been around for somewhat over 10 years, but it has been voluntary. And what does human rights due diligence mean, or due diligence in general? It is this process. It is to identify, prevent, or mitigate, and ultimately terminate adverse impacts on corporate activities on human rights and the environment. It is in making. The Commission has given the proposal in February, and there have been some national parliaments' opinions posted on the Commission website. Haven't checked in the last 2 weeks, but adoption could be expected maybe 2026 or 2027. I know that there have been some people who have said that this will not come to an end. It will never be adopted. I don't have an opinion on that. I'm not well informed enough whether that would be a possibility at all. But basically, the directive lays down rules on corporate due diligence obligations, directors' duties, civil liability, and protection of persons reporting breaches. That in a nutshell. Why? Now, what is the background? It's the legal fragmentation, what is going on in Europe regarding corporate sustainability. There are already countries that have passed their own laws regarding the issue, and some big corporations, for example, are of the opinion that they would like to level the playing field, and politicians are of the opinion that it's not a good idea to have well over 20 different types of legislations on the sustainability matters, that rather have one on the EU level. So instead of fragmented legislation, to have an EU level legislation. Well, who would fall under the scope of this directive? The current proposal covers about 13,000 EU companies and 4,000 non-EU companies. There are two groups of both EU limited liability companies and then non-EU limited liability companies. This is rather detailed description here. Than for the sake of time, I will not go into reading the details of this, but generally this would apply to larger companies with over 500 employees, and in some specific high-risk sectors that a requirement for the company size and turnover would be somewhat lower. Micro companies and SMEs would not be directly in the scope, but they would be indirectly affected as a result of the actions taken by the larger companies, because since they have to report on their corporate sustainability, it kind of trickles down to the smaller ones as well. Entire value chain would be covered. So upstream and downstream, besides own operations, indirect suppliers, direct suppliers, and then downstream customers and product disposal. So it is extensive, as Erik already mentioned. Obligations that are expected are aligned with existing standards, though, I would say. Substantive requirements are in the annex of the proposal, they define adverse effects as a violation of rights and prohibitions laid down in international human rights conventions and environmental conventions. As for the due diligence process requirements for human rights, it is rather clear that the most important, the paramount document is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And then the proposal refers to OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conducts. Substantive requirements were quickly mentioned in the last slides, but in the annex, it mentions 21 violations of rights and prohibitions included in the international human rights conventions and treaties. 22 different international human rights conventions are referenced. I've not really done a calculation myself that would the 22 conventions include more than 21 violations. I kind of think that they could include more than that, depending on how you classify different violations. And then in the annex, there are specifically 12 violations of internationally recognized objectives and prohibitions included in the environmental conventions. In addition, Group 1 companies shall adopt a plan to ensure that business model and strategy are compatible with the limiting of global warming to 1.5 Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement. So due diligence process requirements. Due diligence process, like I said, is a well-known concept since 2011 when the UNGPs were adopted, endorsed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. There has been, and many companies have adopted this process of committing and having policies for human rights due diligence, to do impact, risk and impact assessments, to prevent and mitigate, to seize the actual adverse impacts, to have complaints procedures or grievance mechanisms, to monitor the effectiveness, and to communicate. And in case of an actual adverse impacts, to remedy the violation. So that is the process that the companies would be, well, let's say that they are expected to have the process already, obviously, but then they would be required to have it. Further, there are member states would have to lay down rules on sanctions applicable to infringements that ensure that companies are liable for damages if they fail to comply with the obligations to prevent and remedy adverse impacts. There would be supervisory authorities. Each member state would designate an authority with powers at least to order the cessation of infringements, to impose pecuniary sanctions, and to adopt interim measures to avoid the risk of severe and irreparable harm. There are contractual cascading issues. Companies shall bind their business partners to comply with human rights and environmental rights. And to provide guidance and support, the Commission would adopt guidance about voluntary model contract clauses. Coming to the end and highlighting the impact on directors' duties, it is good to note that not taking the specific consideration into account when fulfilling the duty to act in the best interest of the company will have to qualify as a breach of directors' duties under the laws of the member states. So this is also very important to prepare for. So what to prepare for and how to do it? I mean, I would say for a company, if I was a sustainability manager, I would suspect that you would already be familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidance. If not, start reading these 3 documents. If you are and you are already applying, check and recheck and improve your process, because as we know, the human rights due diligence processes haven't been of that great of a quality according to various studies that have been conducted on national and international level. Then, and if there is no due diligence process for either or the human rights or the environment, then roll up the sleeves and start building one. It is not a quick exercise, so it's anyhow good to do it. Start doing it and get expert help to get there faster and with better quality. Those would be my 3 points of advice. And that's it for my part. I'm happy to take some questions if there is there from audience. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Kristiina. I have one, because now we have seen some national law in different countries in Europe. How much can they be used as guidelines for people sitting elsewhere than these countries when it comes to preparing for this?
Do you mean countries outside EU?
Oh, I guess we have in Norway and Germany and France who have made some national laws already in this area. Is that something that you can already now use as guidelines, or do they differ a lot?
Yeah, sure. I would say that yes, but I have to say that I don't know the nitty-gritty details of the national legislation. So there are differences, unlike the UK Modern Slavery Act, which was already adopted first. I don't remember now the year, but it was first one of the sort of before Brexit, obviously, that had a more narrow take on the issues. And to my understanding, the latest one of these, the Norwegian Transparency Act, would be the one that would be maybe closest to this proposal. But I would say that there is plenty of guidance around the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. United Nations has produced it. There is the working group following the implementation of the guidance, and there are many of the large global companies have implemented that for many years.
Okay. I have one more question. I have a question from Sarah, who asked which companies are subject to the ESG and will also include private companies. If yes, which? I don't know if it makes. Can you hear me, Kristiina?
Yeah, sorry. So can you just repeat the question that it was about?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I got a question here from Sarah, who is asking which companies are subjected to the ESG and will it also include private companies? If yes, which?
To ESG, meaning?
Yeah, but I'm not sure. Maybe it actually is pointing towards Erik's talks early on.
Well, but if I understand it, maybe I misunderstand it. But if you are, if these requirements would, it's are, yeah, they for UN for the due diligence expectations, they apply to all companies. Let's say, yeah, it doesn't matter actually even the size, the expectation to respect human rights, that is for all the companies. But maybe I might now misunderstand the question somehow.
No, but I guess it's nice that we all have to respect those things. I guess I would like to say thank you very much, Kristiina, for talking about this subject and this area. I think it's something that we are all looking forward to follow in the years to come. So thank you a lot.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just a final thing that I would like to add, that even if this proposal doesn't go through, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the EU Taxonomy Minimum Safeguards, they are also referring to the due diligence process. So no need to wait for this proposal to start working on the due diligence. Thank you.
I think that was a good advice. Then we have our next subject, and it will be a little bit different, that as we will go away from existing and coming EU directive, and instead hear about Britta Nielsen. Britta Nielsen, a Danish social worker who have been convicted of stealing about 13 million euros from the state of Denmark. And yeah, here next to me I have Emil, who is an investigating journalist at TV2 and the author of a book about Britta Nielsen. So I'm looking forward to hear about the Britta Nielsen and your findings. So Emil, please.
Yes, hello, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm always looking forward to telling this story. And yes, I'll start to introduce myself a little bit more. I'm a journalist working for Danish national broadcaster TV2, and I wrote this book about Britta Nielsen, which was a subject that I covered while the whole case was big. And it is a case about one of the biggest con women in Danish history, at least within the authorities of Denmark. And I will, in this short time that we have, because it's a very big story, I'll try to explain why I think she did it and how it could happen at all. And yeah, let's get on with it. Just to make sure that everybody is a little bit on board about this story, because it was very big in Denmark, but this is an international crowd, so there's probably a lot of you that hasn't heard about it. Britta Nielsen was a 64 years old woman in 2008 when she was caught. She's a little bit older now, 4 years older. She stole 117 million Danish kroners, the equivalent of around 16 million euros from the Danish state, people that was destined to some of the social vulnerable groups of Denmark. And she fled to South Africa in the end of September 2017, while just before the authorities realized that she stole all that money. But when she found out that it was about to happen, I'll get into that later. And she was on the run in South Africa for about a month and a half, and then she was finally caught. And that is the story in very big lines. And now we'll try to get a little more into to the details. Just a second here. There you go. Yes. That is a picture of Britta Nielsen working behind her computer screens in the National Board of Social Services. That is where she worked. She managed a fund designed to support projects for the most social vulnerable people in Denmark. It could be homeless, addicts, people with disabilities. It was called Satspuljen, and every year there was around 1 billion kroner to give to these social groups. And one of the keys for understanding how this could happen at all and how she could get away with it is to understand how a trusted person she was within the office. Even though she wasn't a manager by rank, she had a very big authority, and nobody in the office expected that she would do anything like this. And for an example, she got the Queen's Medal of Merit 1.5 years before she was caught doing this, and while she received it, her boss held a speech praising her hard work and loyalty to the office. And in the official recommendation for the medal, it was underlined that she always made sure everything was in order. But actually, she didn't really want it to receive this medal to begin with, and that was kind of her reputation in the office. She was very humble. She didn't make a big deal about anything. She actually wrote in the invitation for this reception that was held in the when she was to receive the medal, that my expectation for this day is completely informal atmosphere, and that correlated pretty good with how she was perceived in the office. She didn't talk a lot about her private life. People didn't have any idea that she had a lot of money. Actually, she seemed like the kind of person who would not spend a lot of money. So that was one of the reasons why nobody suspected her of doing anything like this. And just a second, I'll just need to get my windows here clear. Perfect. But to understand the case of Britta Nielsen, we should get a little into her background. She had a tough childhood. You see, this is the picture of a street in Denmark with social homing projects where she grew up. She had a mother that was that had a lot of psychological problems. She was suicidal, tried to kill herself several times, according to Britta Nielsen herself. She told in the courtroom during the trial against her. Her father had blue collar work, didn't earn a lot of money. And she described her childhood as being quite tough, lacking of money, moving a lot around, and very insecure. But Britta Nielsen, together with the rest of the Danish society, had an enormous better rise of social class living. She during the early years of her life, you saw the rise of the welfare society as well as the rise of Britta Nielsen's living standards. This is a graph showing the social expenses in the Danish society, and you can see, like, from around the 50s, where Britta Nielsen, she was born in 55, up till 77, when she got a job in the National Board of Social Services. There was an extreme rise in social expenditures within the Danish state. And that was a time where the welfare state was developed, and there was a lot of welfare reforms. And all those welfare reforms, they also helped Britta Nielsen gaining life in the social middle class, which is she found a house in the suburbs of Copenhagen in a town called Hvidovre, and this is actually a place in Hvidovre which was founded by the same movement in society, which also founded the welfare state. So she pretty much moved into the physical symbol of the welfare state. And she moved in there with her husband and with her 3 kids, and everything was pretty normal. They all had a very good life, and everything seemed very what would you say? Yeah, very normal, very common. But actually, there was one little problem in her life, and that was that they bought a house that was a little too expensive, and they had problems paying the loan and the rents, and she didn't see any other way than to start stealing from her work, Britta Nielsen said. And she was asked in court, why did you do it? And she explained that she came from this background herself with a lot of insecurity, and she didn't want her children to experience the same in their childhood. So that was why she started taking a little bit of money to begin with from her work, and it's not really sure when she started. She couldn't remember herself while testifying in court, but the data from the investigation gives some indication that it was at least in 93 that she started stealing from her work, but likely it was earlier than that. But doing the investigation, it wasn't possible to get data from earlier than 93. So she at least started stealing at that point. And to begin with, actually her husband found out. He checked the mailbox, and he could see that there was a letter from the bank saying that they received an amount of money. She didn't remember how much, and he didn't know where the money came from. So he confronted Britta Nielsen, and she started crying and confessed that it was money that she took from her work, and she promised her husband that she would pay them back and never do it again. But that was the first lie, because she didn't pay them back, and she kept stealing from her work in order to get money to support her family. And instead of getting letters in her own mailbox, she made a post box in the post office. So she would get mails from the bank there afterwards. And then I'll try to explain a little about how she actually took the money. And I'll get back to the house you see there in the picture in a short while. But first of all, it was extremely simple how she did it. There was no brilliant or genius thoughts in this crime, at least not to begin with. The fund that she managed with her colleagues was, as I mentioned earlier, a fund where NGOs or authorities or other departments within the state could apply for money for projects that would go to the socially vulnerable people of Denmark. And Britta Nielsen's job was to help decide which project met the standards for this funding. It could, for example, be that the politician said, yeah, but we got 50 million kroners for homeless this year, and we want them especially for young homeless. And then an NGO could say, okay, we want to apply for 2 million kroners, going to build some kind of project for young homeless people. And then Britta would look at the application and say, okay, you can get this money or you can't get this money. And what she did to make money for herself was that she just created her own fictional NGOs, and then just started sending money from this fund to her own fictional NGOs that had her own bank account number. And then she made up all kind of fictional NGO names. There were some of them was quite ironically named when we got the knowledge that we got today. One of them was called Help to Self-Help. One of the fictional NGOs that she actually created was had the address of this red house that you see, and the reason I chose this house was that it actually shows kind of how sloppy she was in her work, that there wasn't really any criminal mastermind behind it, because actually this red house belonged to a man that he had to be abroad for some months doing some work, and Britta Nielsen, she rented that house just for a month or so because she needed a place to house some entrepreneurs that had to do some work on her own house. And at the same time, she had to create a new NGO for her crime, and she just chose this house and this man's name, and by that she managed to con about 2 million kroners out of the Danish state. And this way, using these kind of fictional project was the method she used the most. In all, she stole 117 millions, and I think around 90 millions was this very, very simple way to do it. And in theory, of course, her boss should approve all decisions of funding to any of these NGOs, but that was just in theory, because the system within the National Board of Services was built the way that she could easily circumvent the boss approval of these funding. And in theory, these fictional NGOs should also both send in budgets and annual accounts to be checked. But within the office that Britta Nielsen sat in, they had a system where they could choose themselves to which budgets and annual accounts, financial accounts they would check, and not surprisingly, Britta Nielsen, she always chose to control the documents from her own fictional NGOs, and of course there were no documents. She just made it look like that in the system. And then in 2005, something very central happened to this story, and to explain how it went so far with this crime. And that was there were tragedy in the family of Britta Nielsen. She had a husband, 3 children, 2 daughters, 1 son, and in 2005 the husband died suddenly after a surgery in the hospital that wasn't supposed to be very dangerous. And that was of course a very traumatic event for the family, and all of the members of the family have more or less told the same story about this very trauma that was that this event caused, and they didn't really know how to deal with this trauma. They didn't share their thoughts. They didn't talk about it. They just kept their grief to themselves. And Britta Nielsen told in trial that she didn't really know how to get on with this and how to bring the family forward. So instead, she called in her 3 children and asked them all to write a name of a travel destination far away from Denmark and put them in a ball. And then they draw one of the papers. It said South Africa. And then the family took a long vacation in South Africa. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks. And it worked. I don't know if you could see it, but in the left side of this this photo, that's Britta Nielsen as well, in one of the very few photos of her actually smiling. And so it seems like that vacation in 2006 did something good for the family, and they decided to buy a house as well in a Danish cooperation association in Africa, a piece of land where you could buy part of the association, the co-op, and then you had the right to build a house. And that's what Britta Nielsen and her family did. And this was called Dannevirke. And Dannevirke is also a very historical name in Danish. It's the name of a defense line fronting Germany. And this place, Dannevirke, was supposed to be this community for Danish people that wanted a house in South Africa next to one of the big safari parks, the Kruger National Safari Park. And in the beginning, it worked really well, and the community worked, and people were doing stuff together. For example, they had these meals where everybody was eating together these evenings. And here you can see Britta Nielsen is the woman with the white hair, and this is her son Jimmy on her right side, or the right from us, and her daughter Samina on the right again, on the other side of the table. And in the beginning, this community worked, but soon there started being some conflicts, and it was very clear that there were some different thoughts of how to run this cooperation between all these families, and a lot of these conflicts had Britta as part of them, and I never got to talk to Britta. So I never really know how she thought about, and they never told me how she thought about this whole case. But I got a hold of some of the emails within the community of Dannevirke, and in the end of this, Britta Nielsen sent an email to one of her friends that I have, and I think that shows a lot about how Britta Nielsen's think about communities and money, and also about other Danish people, the ones that the whole population that she frauded for so many money. And what she wrote was, after some of these conflicts: "We have lost the joy at Dannevirke. We love our house, but we're tired of the lack of support to keep Dannevirke going, which is necessary. People are crying over small amounts, and there is a pettiness that is so preposterous Danish that I'm about to throw up. I'm not interested in more of that. We have enough of that in Denmark already." So I think that gives a little peek view into how Britta Nielsen actually thought about some of these issues about money and community. And one of the reasons why I'm telling you about South Africa and this whole period of Britta Nielsen's life is also because this is where we really see how her crime and stealing was peaking. I don't know if this is a little small for you guys, but you see around the middle of this table in 2007, you see that the numbers of the amount that she stole from her work almost double, and it continues to grow in the upcoming years. And that is exactly when she started her South African adventure. She bought the house and built it in 2006 and 7. And then it just kept on the crime and the money that the amount of money that she stole just started growing from there on. And it was partly because of her own spending in South Africa, but it was also in large part because of 2 of her children that you saw in the pictures just before, Jimmy and her daughter Samina. Just Jimmy, he moved to South Africa as well, and he got, as well as his one sister and the other sister, luxury cars. He spent a huge amount of money for gamer equipment. One of the daughters developed, in her own words, shopaholic condition, where she used around 50,000 euros a year just for shopping, and she had a very, very expensive hobby of horse riding. I'm not sure what it's called in English, but the sport where the horses are jumping, and she actually got to live in one of the most expensive horse farms in the world within this field of horse sports. It's in Germany, called Schockemühle. And Britta bought her several horses that costed several millions of Danish kroners. And she also tried to make a business with these horses. One of her daughter Samina, and it went really bad. And Britta had to support this business for several years, just posting money in it and never making any profit. And it was basically the same story with her son, who moved to live in South Africa. It was also just trying to make businesses again and again. He tried to make to open a nightclub, a restaurant, tried to open some kind of real estate development firms, and all of them went really bad. And all the time, Britta Nielsen had to support these businesses and the lack of profit from these businesses. So that is a lot of the explanation to where all of this money went that she stole. And she had a huge personal spending as well herself. And all of that continued from 93 till 2012, and apparently nobody suspected anything, at least not that I have found in my research of this case. But in 2012, there was their first alarm that was sound, and it was from her bank that sent a letter to the Danish Police Office of Money Laundering, and said that there was this customer that had some suspicious activity, and they wrote, the customer receives large transfers both privately and to a horse company, which are subsequently withdrawn in cash. And we find it difficult to see why the customer should withdraw so much cash, and why a ministry, and by here they refer to the National Board of Social Services, should support a horse company. And you must say that they were very wide. They had reason to be suspicious because that didn't make any sense. But unfortunately, the Office of Money Laundering in Danish police was severely understaffed at this point in time, so they didn't do anything about the letter from the bank. They actually just passed it on to the tax authorities, saying that it might be some kind of tax fraud. And unfortunately, the tax authorities in this point of time also were severely understaffed, so this just ended in a big pile of cases, and nobody never did anything about it, unfortunately. Then there is a question, why wasn't she caught in her own organization? And there was, as I briefly mentioned before, a lack of internal control mechanisms. One of them was, as I mentioned, that there were no systemic control of financial accounts from the project that was funded, and it was very easy just to make sure that you could very easy for Tønnesen to make sure that you could just control her own projects. And the other thing that was failing within the internal control mechanism was that she had a double function. She was both able to submit and change the bank account numbers within the system, as well as she was able to actually do bank transactions. And I've been told by several experts in this area that those two functions should never be handled by the same person. They must always be handled by two different persons. And that was basically, I mean, if you look into the investigation, there's a lot more detailed explanation on her methods, but there was basically the two lack of internal control mechanism that was there for all of the 25 years that we know that this crime was going on, and it was still present when she was caught in 2018. But there was another really big factor that made this whole thing possible, and it was that she was a very, very trusted person. She in 2018, when she received the Medal of Merit, she had worked there in the same office for 40 years. So she was also kind of a gatekeeper to all the systems within this office. Even the managers of the office depended on her sometimes to explain how things worked. So she knew pretty much what was going on all the time. And everybody came to her. And just to try to explain the level of trust that she had among her colleagues, because, oh no, just a second. There it was. Because I personally don't think that any of her colleagues ever suspected anything or was involved in this crime. And just to tell you about one example of this trust, I'll show you this picture of a hamster wheel, and I'll get back to that later, just in a while, because in the end, she couldn't just steal directly from the fund anymore, as the example I I told you about earlier, she actually had to steal from projects and take money that was already earmarked other organizations. It was a bit more difficult for her. She had to take bigger risk, and she actually had to lie a lot more. But she managed to get away with it, because every time that she could hear that somebody saw something not being right around her office, she could step in and do something about it, and make sure that nobody suspected there was anything real wrong. And she could do that because she was there all the time, because she knew all the systems, until she wasn't there anymore. Because one day in the summer of 2018, she was playing with her grandson in a playground that had this kind of playground equipment called a hamster wheel, and she fell in that and she had a concussion. So she wasn't on work for a couple of months, and therefore she was not working when some of her colleagues found out that there was missing 69,047 kroner for a project for a home housing people with psychiatric problems. And normally, if she had been at work, she would probably hear that somebody talked about some missing money, and she would find a solution, take the money from somewhere else and send it back to the project. But she was not there to intervene. So instead, her colleagues tried to figure out what happened to these 69,047 kroner, and they found out that it was not paid to the bank account of the Home for Psychiatric people with psychiatric problems. It was actually paid to a bank account in Hvidovre, close to Britta's home that we saw a picture of earlier. So they kept on investigating. They did a scan in their system, and they saw that there was actually a lot of transitions to this bank account number. And they called the bank. They wouldn't give her British colleagues the name of her, but they told her that she was a private female person. So they have those two. They had those two informations now. Then they did a new scan to see who actually submitted the bank account number, and they figure out that that was Britta Nielsen. All of these, they got this file showing that it was Britta Nielsen. So all of her colleagues knew, or not, some of her colleagues knew that there was transferred several amounts to an account close to Britta Nielsen's home, that the account belonged to a private female person, and that it was Britta Nielsen who actually submitted the bank account details to all of these transactions. And still, like even with those details that should have every alarm go, say boom, 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 they actually called her and asked her about help for something, and said they could not understand all of this. And then she knew that something was wrong, and she had time to flee to South Africa and to what it seems like hide a lot of her money. But that is still something that we don't have clear evidence of. And she ran to South Africa, where she met with some friends, and she went out and bought a new house in South Africa. And this is a picture taken from this Britta on the left and her friend on the right, looking at houses. There was a house in a little town called Southbroom, and she told her friend that there actually were some problems back with her work in Denmark. Her friend didn't have any idea how big a case it was, but she explained that the reason she took some money from her work was that she could never say no when her children asked for a new car or a new horse. And she said, "I've created the monsters that my children have become." And that was as close as an explanation to this whole case that I ever found. And then she was caught. It looks like this. We managed to find a video from the arrest in the beginning of November in a hotel room in South Africa, Johannesburg. And I think that concludes my presentation of this case. And if there are any questions, I think we just have some minutes to take them now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emil, for telling us about that crazy story. One thing that I noticed were that the slide you showed us, where we can see how much she have been stealing or lending each year, so that she started with smaller amounts, and then it became more and more and more. And I guess also that tells us or reminds us how it is that we people sometimes act, that it start with the moral compass to get a little bit out of course, and then if it isn't being corrected, then it becomes worse and worse, which I guess this story clearly tells us with 16 million euros.
Yeah, 16 million. Yeah, and I think that's a very correct way to put this story. That she obviously found out that, or she obviously had experienced that there were no consequence in this, and then it just kept on growing.
Yeah, it is crazy, but it also makes a great bridge to the next session. So before I talk about that, then once again, thank you very much, Emil, for telling us the story and sharing it with us.
Thank you very much for letting me tell the story.
Because I think actually this story actually makes a great bridge into our next subject, and the last subject we have today, which is why good people do bad things, and how can the ethical behavior of individuals be changed. So and with me here for this last session in the Nordic session, I'm more than happy to present Elizabeth Wilks-Wood from Carlsberg Group, who is the Vice President for Compliance. And in this session, I will try and ask Elizabeth some questions, mainly about ethical behaviors. But first of all, a warm welcome to Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you. Hope everyone can hear me okay.
We can.
Perfect.
The first question that I like to ask you, just to start a little bit back, so what made you decide to become a barrister, and how did you end up or getting into the field of compliance, where you have been the last many years?
Sure. So those who might not know what a barrister is, you can probably hear from my accent that I'm from the UK. In the UK, there are two types of lawyers. So one is the ones that you see on the dramas. They're in the court with the white wig and the black gown with the little white tabs. And that's what a barrister is. So we specialize in courtroom advocacy. I decided that I wanted to be a barrister when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And it's because I saw one on a TV drama. It was a black lady, it was a courtroom drama, she was in the outfit, and it was the coolest thing that I'd ever seen as a child. And so I decided that I wanted to be a barrister, even though I didn't quite know what one of those was. She seemed to have lots of people listening to her, and there was a good outfit. So that's why I decided to become a barrister. And why did I move into compliance? I think like lots of people, I kind of fell into compliance by accident. I'm a telecoms and a competition lawyer. And the company that I was working for at the time was subject to a competition law infringement. I was probably one of the people that complained the most about compliance because I didn't understand it. It was really bureaucratic and difficult to do. And the general counsel at the time suggested that I run it instead of complain about it. So I fell into compliance by accident.
That's a good story, and I guess also many of us can relate to that with the compliance sometimes being a little bit of a hassle, but in the end, I guess we just need to embrace it. But you have worked as a compliance professional in many different industries, and when you look back and across these industries, is there some what can you say comment about the sectors in regards to what is most bad with the challenges that are in these different sectors?
Sure. So when I was working in the gambling sector, so I was the head of compliance for the casino part of the Ritz Hotel. That was super hard because gambling was like another language. It has its own culture, its own terminology, and its own technology, so that was tricky. With Carlsberg, it was the first time that I'd worked in a multinational that was that big and in that many jurisdictions. But I suppose the common thing is our job is all about people, their behaviour, and trying to help make their behaviour better and to help them make ethical decisions. So even though the sectors and the industries that I've been in have been very different, those issues are common. Sometimes people just do crazy things and our job is to try to help them make better decisions, and that's been the same when I've crossed different countries and when I've crossed different sectors as well.
When you look at, because now when you have been in this field for that many years, I know this is maybe a little bit of a broad question to ask, but what would you say what are the primarily drivers when it comes to unethical decision making in organizations?
Sure. So I suppose based on my experience, when people do crazy things, it's because of it's one of three things. So sometimes it's just that they simply don't know better. They're not aware of the rules or the risks, and that they take them because they're just unaware of them. Secondly, people know exactly what they're doing, and sometimes there's a personal benefit. So maybe it benefits them financially to do something naughty, and that's why they do it. Or the third one is sometimes there can be incentives to drive a particular behaviour which is in conflict with compliance. So I'll use an example. Let's think about somebody who's the head of procurement, for example. And one of the incentives that they have is simply to source vendors who are the very, very cheapest, the lowest cost ones that the company can get. If you can imagine the behaviour that head of procurement would do, but it would be different if perhaps their incentives were not only to source a low-cost provider, but also a provider that produced the product in an ethical way. So sometimes the incentives that we apply to individuals mean that they actually are in conflict with doing the right thing. And in my experience, people will do what they're incentivized to do. Companies pay people bonuses, companies structure the way that people are paid or the recognition that they get because they're trying to drive a particular behavior. But sometimes those incentives work against compliance and can work against ethics. And often, in my experience, especially when people circumvent controls, when people know what to do, but they choose to do something different, it's because there's a conflict between the incentives. They're often incentive on what they achieve, not how they achieve it. And because of that, people sometimes end up inadvertently breaking the rules. And then often when you've broken the rules and there are no consequences, that can continue. And sometimes small non-compliance can get bigger and bigger because first time it was an accident and you got away with it. You're kind of looking over your shoulder, waiting for somebody to identify you. And then the next time you still get away with it. And then over time, you just kind of go, oh, okay, let's continue. So sometimes a small non-compliance that's not detected can end up being a very enduring non-compliance just because people are incentivized to do the wrong thing instead of the right thing.
I guess also when we talk about the behavior on this case, ethical behaviors, but then it's easier to talk about. I guess it's a lot harder to change. And could you maybe give us some insights in regards to what it is that you're doing in order to change these ethical behaviors or make sure that they doesn't change from the current ones, so we
Sure.
don't end up in a story like the one we heard before with a big froster.
Of course. So I suppose, what is it that I'm trying to do? So I'm trying to do kind of three things. So firstly, I try to look at what behaviours people are trying to incentivize and to see, are we putting people in a dilemma? Is there a conflict between doing the right thing and just getting the job done? So firstly, to have a look at incentives. So I do a lot of that. Secondly, to try to have a look at the data. So when non-compliance occurs, either within my company or within another company, to try to understand what were the root causes of that. Why did that happen? Was it a people failure? Was it a process failure? Was it, I don't know, some other failure? And to try to understand what can I learn from that and what do I need to change to try to reduce the likelihood of that happening. And in particular, if I can find patterns within the data that are indicative of a risk emerging, then we try to target support and guidance and awareness where we can see those risks are increasing. So the next thing is kind of looking at the data and understanding why things go wrong. And then the third thing is, if I look back as to why I moved into compliance or why I was probably the person that complained about compliance the most in my old company, it's that sometimes compliance can itself be the barrier to doing the right thing. As a lawyer, I live in this world of lots of paper and complexity, and I'm in compliance. I tend to find that we're the people who would do the right thing no matter how difficult it was. But often the business are just trying to get through the day. They're just trying to do things as simply and efficiently as possible. And so, as an example, if it takes 4 forms to find the right form to complete, if it requires 3 people to sign it off, then it's not really a surprise that people in a hurry will just not do it. So the other thing that I try to do is to try to find friction in our processes. Are there ways that we can make it easier for people to do the right thing every day? What I love doing, is my personality type, is I love fixing processes that are broken. And when I fix a broken process, I try to figure out how can I weave compliance and ethics into it so that it's seamless. People do the right thing because it's actually really easy to do now. I use the analogy of how easy it is to order things on Amazon. They have something called one click. So I look at a book that I like, I can click it and it's almost automatically, they take the money, they're figuring out the delivery and I can get it delivered the next day. It's super easy for me to do it. What I try to do is to try to make compliance like that. There's one click, it's really simple. And often if I am really good, doing the right thing, doing the compliant thing is the easiest and the most simple for the business to do. They do it by default, not because they have the same kind of moral code that I do, but just because it's easy and simple for them to do and they like things that are easy and simple. So yeah, try to do a combination of understanding why it happened, looking for it in the data, and make it super easy for people to choose to do the right thing every day.
Of course, now I need to be careful I don't put words in your mouth, but when you describe it like this, you make it sound almost easy. But I guess what I'm thinking, you must need a strong mandate, because I guess you work. It's not in a silo. Then you have to work across the organization, and that cannot be easy.
No, I think you're right. Having a strong mandate is really, really important. And I think the other thing is to find your advocates, to find the people who are like you. So within Carlsberg, the way that we do compliance is we have a small team of subject matter experts in Copenhagen. And in every market, we have at least one lawyer. A proportion of their time is spent doing compliance. So my job is to kind of make them look amazing. Everything that I do is to make them the very best compliance people that they can be. So we provide guidance and checklists and simple tick sheets for them to do everything that we want them to do in the right way. And they become the advocates, they become the ambassadors for compliance in their respective markets. So the only way that I figured out how to do compliance well is to have a really clear mandate from the top and to have the support of key advocates around the business. Because, for example, we're in maybe 140 markets around the world. and I'm in Copenhagen. And if there's a risk that's emerging in Asia or China or, I don't know, another place in the world when I've gone to bed, it's really important that the person that's in that market knows how I think, knows what risks look like, and can take the same action as if the business got me on the phone. And so what you want to do is find those people who get it and help them to be like you, help them to advocate for compliance and make their job super easy. We even, for example, have a little monthly newsletter. One of the things that we have is a compliance hero of the month. So every month we take the opportunity to kind of celebrate one of these advocates, because as a lawyer, rarely do people celebrate anything that we do. And so what we try to do is to kind of celebrate the people that support us, because that will encourage them to support us even more.
Another thing, because as we can hear, and as you also said in the introduction, you're from UK, but you have also been working in Dubai and the Caribbean, and is now sitting in Denmark. And when looking at compliance, what can I say, challenges, or how it's looked upon, can you say anything about the culture and how that may differ?
Yeah, I think culture is, for me, it's super important. So culture for me lives in the space between what we say and what we do. My shorthand for culture is it's the way that things get done. It's all the silent stuff that never gets written down, but it's the way that people behave, it's the way that people make their decisions. And I've worked in really different cultures, and I think compliance, being cognizant of those cultural differences, is really important. And so, as an example, in some of the markets that I support in Asia, there really isn't a culture of questioning your seniors. So, for example, if we're doing a speak up campaign to encourage people to blow the whistle, I need to be really careful and not say things like, even if it's your manager, feel free to tell us, because in some cultures that simply won't work. It's the truth, but I need to perhaps refine the message so that it resonates more with that culture. One of the reasons that I really love Copenhagen is that I found the Danes are super trusting, which is fabulous. But one of the things as a cynical Brit is that I kind of go, yeah, I trust people, but I also want to verify and check that they've done it. But that's not necessarily very usual for the Danes. So again, I need to find local people like the Danes to help me navigate the culture. So I suppose one of the tips is to find the people in those cultures and to use them to help you guide the way around the little cultural nuances. It's even as simple as sometimes the translation of a word that I'll use for whistleblowers. I need to make sure that I've tested that with somebody who's a native speaker, because as an example, in German, if I use one translation of the word whistleblower, it has a really negative connotation, but if I use a different word, it has a really positive one. So those advocates know the culture as well, and to use them to help you to navigate those cultural nuances, because I would never understand them. But if you speak to the people who know those cultures, they can help you to kind of just make the little adjustments to mean that you're much more powerful and you're much more influential than you would be otherwise.
Then a question more related to the tools. Of course, we're all aware of a whistleblowing solution can be one tool, but do you have other tools that you use in your work when you work with compliance?
Sure. I'm married to a software developer. I'm not as much of a geek as he is, but I'm a geek in training. So I love data. One of the ways that I try to remove friction from the business is if I can automate a compliance control, it's quite sneaky. Usually it means that it's less friction for the business. It's easier for them to do the right thing. For example, it's easier for them to do a conflict of interest disclosure using an automated tool than it is that if I send them a form in Word and they have to sign it and get their boss to sign it, etc. So where possible, I try to automate compliance controls because it gives me real-time insight about what people are doing, but more importantly, what people are not doing. So for example, if let's use an example of a gift register. I haven't automated it, it's on my list of things to do. But if you have an automated gift register, it gives you the opportunity not only to see which markets gifts are common, But also, if you never see a market ever completing a gift register, that's amazing insight that you just kind of go, that's a bit unusual. Is it that they just never accept gifts, or is it that they did but something's gone wrong? So I try to think about ways to automate the things that I need people to do to reduce risk, because if I can automate compliance controls, it gives me insight about what's going on around the world, especially in places where I might not quite understand what's going on. So at the moment, I'm looking into automating things like the conflict of interest disclosure, and I'm just about to launch a new third-party screening tool as well. So yeah, increasingly trying to use automation to make it easier. So the business feels it's easier because it's a button to push. And it's great for me because it gives me real-time insight about what they're doing or what they're not doing.
Exciting. But then maybe a last question.
Sure.
What does the future holds for you, Elizabeth?
How exciting. Hopefully staying in Copenhagen because it's lovely. It's gorgeous. It's so clean. Everybody's so tall and so polite, and your English is beautiful, so that's good. Hopefully continuing to work with really amazing people on really, really challenging issues. I love a challenge. And just continuing to evolve. And for me, one of the reasons that I love compliance is, in a small way, I believe that we're trying to make the world a more ethical place. And so I genuinely love what I do, and I genuinely love trying to help people to make better ethical decisions. So as long as I can keep doing that, I'll be super happy.
I think it's some good drivers to have when you work in this field, Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
You've got to take the wins where you can.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you and this session, and even though I could ask a million more questions, I bet we better have to round up so people can get home from this session here.
Thank you so much.
So,
it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, Elizabeth. So that means that the only thing left here is to, first of all, give a big thanks to the key speakers that we have had in this session, but also a big thanks to the audience, to all of you who have joined the Nordic session. And I'm hoping to see you all again tomorrow for the next leg of this ECEC conference. So, but until then, have a nice evening. Bye.